Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, it's time for our popular business community update. We're going to hear from two of the state's leading representatives of business organizations, and then the schools are back. What about the health of Pennsylvania schools? All of that. Well, why not say this? Let's get to it.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, welcome back to the program. Well, we have two of our frequent guests for our little business panel, business update. Fred Anton, he's the CEO of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, and Gene Barr, he heads the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, often just known as that chamber guy. Gene jokes about that all the time. Gene, let me start with you, and then we'll get to Fred. All right, the legislature comes back 1 month. You got it? 12 days or something like that in session. Do I got that right?
That's about it, yeah.
What's the business community looking for out of the Republican-controlled legislature? Let me point that out, right?
Well, there's a few things that, in our view, are poised to go. One of them is ending an exemption for parties involved in a collective bargaining dispute from stalking and harassment. It's, we've seen some of the stuff that's happened in Philadelphia, and some of that has been exempted. Some of them, we've had a case tossed out by a judge. We want to end that. We want to make
How would that work?
Right now, parties engaged in that are exempt from stalking harassment laws. This would simply say that you can continue to picket, but anything that comes under that goes beyond that, you can be held liable for. Because we've had at least one case that's been tossed as part of that. The other thing that we want to get done is some changes in terms of when physicians can dispense medication. We're finding that when we allow physicians to dispense extensively, and very few do it, what happens is it adds to workers' comp cost. It adds to problems with addiction, and in reality, it keeps workers out of work longer, so we want to change that. So there's a couple things. Also, look, we've had the discussions about pension and liquor reform. Those are still sitting there, and we'll see if they can get to those while they're back.
Fred, what's on your agenda?
Let me discuss.
You can discuss those. Absolutely.
I think it's shameful that the legislature has not closed this loophole on union violence. Now, they're hung up over some words of amendment which may be irrelevant or at least cast doubt on whether some violence is acceptable. There's been massive violence, as reported by the Inquirer, in the Philadelphia area. There's a big indictment of union officials. This should be done, and should be done now. It won't be. It won't be. Why won't it be done? Because it's traditional that coming up to the elections, the legislature does not want to.
They want to get out of Dodge.
They want to get out of Dodge. They don't want to pass anything. And they won't do anything on either liquor or pensions. Why? Because if they haven't done anything when they've labored mightily, if they can't do anything, why are they going to do something and antagonize constituencies before the election?
What's so fascinating is that every assessment of the Pennsylvania legislature is that it's likely to remain Republican. You know, who knows whether the Democrats or the Republicans will pick up a few seats in the House, but it won't matter. Gene Barr to control.
112 to 91
That's
Republican.
What I mean.
So they pick up 5. So what?
Yeah, well, and of yet I've not seen any clear assessment about how that's likely to turn out. Senate overwhelmingly, likely to be Republican.
27 to 23, maybe 29 to 21.
Yeah. All right, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But what's the problem then, Gene? Is Fred right? Is it the election? But they all seem relatively safe.
Look, you've got a lot of government unions that are extremely strong. They have the ability to have literally the taxpayer collect their PAC dues for them, ship it over. They're very strong. They have a tremendous sway. It's one of the reasons why Pennsylvania, along with Utah, remains one of the only states that hasn't brought choice and convenience to Pennsylvania's consumers for alcohol purchases. It's one of the reasons why we've done nothing on pensions, why we still have a pretty rich defined benefit program that most people who are in the private sector do not have. Now, the reality is our pension problem is a creation of a number of things, not the least of which is the fact that it wasn't funded for a number of years. Yeah. So that's not their fault. But we need significant reforms there. And
but
as you point out,
of you, before we go to break, and I don't want to go, I'm not letting you go without talking about politics. You would know that we're going to do that. Fred will smile at that. He loves to talk about politics. But let's, Fred, you're not optimistic that they're going to get much done, right?
No, it's not I'm not optimistic. I'm saying definitively they're not going to get anything
done. Are you
a
little more optimistic?
Slightly more optimistic on a couple of these things that are poised to go. It's incredible, as Fred says, we've not been able to do some of these things because you hate to say anything's a no-brainer in this business, but some of them are. When you have cases that are tossed because of an exemption, when you have a female executive who's harassed, stalked, threatened, and well, that's part of a union thing. We can't prosecute. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. We need to change that.
All right, when we come back, we want to take a break. We're going to talk a little bit about the legislative elections, and I can't let these guys go without getting their assessment of the governor's election. I'll put them on the spot. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Gene Barr and Fred Anton are both here, Manufacturers Association and PA Chamber of Business and Industry executives. We're chatting about a bunch of things. We're going to talk about one of their favorite, it wouldn't be one of my favorite topics, would it? Politics. All right, Fred, the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania, what's your prediction? You know, we're getting down to the wire, 55 days or so?
Yes.
You see any big change in the House?
No, I see no change in the House. I think there
remain Republican.
Remain Republican, but basically 112 to 91. I haven't taken a look at, and really an analysis has not been done that I've seen of individual
races.
Races, and bear this in mind. There's much less likelihood of turnover except in well-defined races because incumbent seats have been strengthened as a result of the...
One word.
What?
Gerrymander, right?
Well,
I got that right?
You can call it gerrymandering, but they've been strengthened, and they've also been strengthened in the Senate. Now, there are a number of Senate races that have some nuances in them and so forth. And, of course, the one big question that could significantly affect the Senate would be if Tom Wolf wins big, some of the races...
In the eastern part of the state.
In the eastern part of the state,
McElhenney,
right.
The open seat
with Eric Tomlinson, Pat Brown, Greenfield. If he wins big, there's some thought that the vote at the top of the ticket could affect those seats. But that's unlikely because when Rendell won big in 2006, they all still won, and they're entrenched.
I think the R's keep the House and Senate. I think that the R's in the Senate pick up one or two seats. I think the R's in the House pick up a couple of seats. Some of that related to the Obama issue. I think
that's sort of what most analysts predict. I
think that's what's going to happen. You look, there's a couple of vulnerable Democrat incumbents. I think when you look at that, and as you know, there's always one race that kind of comes out of nowhere. And if one race comes out of nowhere, it's probably part of the Obama effect. Somebody goes, I had no idea he or she was in trouble.
We always have
and there's always one of those.
And
there's always one of those. And the chances if that happens this year, as usually is the case, it's probably going to be a D flip into an R because of Obama.
All right. Republican, I'll stay with you and then we'll go to Fred. Republican-oriented poll, the last poll done, still shows Governor Corbett trailing by 11. It does give the Harper poll. It does give Tom Wolf a 11-point edge, but it has him over 50%.
Correct.
What's Governor Corbett need to do in the last 6 weeks of this race to make it competitive.
Well, look, this great fallacy has hurt him that he's cut $1 billion from education. That has certainly hurt, and that's absolutely incorrect. We know that. The other thing that might happen is Tom Wolf has come out in favor of an increase in Pennsylvania's personal income tax, about a 60% increase depending on what the numbers are. He hasn't put a lot of specificity to that. The reality is, in addition to that hurting individual taxpayers, it's a tax on business because hundreds of thousands of businesses here in Pennsylvania, over 300,000, pay that personal income tax rate, and that a lot of that's going to have to go to pay the increasing pension obligation.
Subchapter S,
yeah,
whatever that's
pass-throughs,
called.
LLCs, all those things. The reality is that's going to take money away from investment in Pennsylvania, being able to hire people, being able to buy equipment, being able to expand operations. It's a huge tax on business, and it's something that we're tremendously concerned about. Now, once that gets out and once more details are applied to that, will that have an impact on the race? I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we will. Fred, your assessment.
Yes. I believe things are going better for Tom Corbett. I think healthy Pennsylvania and his deal with the federal government to have a plan to insure people under Medicaid was a win for Tom Corbett. I think this Penn State situation, I think the Penn State situation is over. I think a lot of the anger that some of the people might have against the governor because of Penn State is dissipated. I believe that a lot can be affected in these last days of the campaign by television advertising. We don't know what the advertisements are going to be. I think he could pick up a substantial number of votes with a good campaign. Also, I think that Wolf is on the wrong track in a lot of his campaigning. For example, I can't believe the media will let him get away with, well, we're going to handle, my pension plan will be announced after the election. I'm not going to deal with the pensions.
All right, we wanted to give you folks a chance to weigh in as always. We'll get differing viewpoints over the course of the next month on this program, as we always do. Well, coming up now, we're going to talk about schools. They're back. Complaints about budgets, something that Gene and Fred both talked about. We'll get a look at a funding commission, how schools are being paid for. This is going to affect property taxes, all sorts of things. Stay with us. I want to thank Gene and Fred for being on. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, representing companies involved in America's most affordable, reliable energy source. To learn more, visit pacoalalliance.com.
Welcome back to the program. Well, schools are now officially back. Actually, they've been back. We're going to check in on the status of our schools. We hear a lot about property tax hikes, perhaps continued program curtailments, staff layoffs. That's been the big news over the past couple of seasons when the kids have returned to Pennsylvania school districts. Let's get a sense about where they stand. Joining me is Jay Himes. He's the executive director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials and someone who runs a school. Sherri Smith, she's the superintendent of Lower Dauphin School District, obviously in Dauphin County. Do I got that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. That's like who's buried in Grant's tomb. We all know that. Okay. Jay, let me start with you. Give us an overview. I'm going to talk budgets. We'll do that in a minute. And the School Funding Commission, something very important. But give us a status overall. What's the health of the schools in our state?
Well, Terry, if we were going to assign a grade to where the fiscal health of schools across this Commonwealth, we'd probably give it a failing. Not failed, but failing. We are in the fourth year of cutbacks of significant proportions in programs for the purpose of reducing personnel, We see about 20 to 25,000 less school employees. We see a continued round of fourth-year cuts in program offerings and additional fees for extracurricular events, totaling over a 4-year period by our annual survey results about 1,000 program reductions.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sherri, you actually have the responsibility for a school district. I don't know the fiscal health of your school. Maybe it's a little better, but describe what you have been through in your school district over the last couple of years.
It's a difficult situation. We budget in January. We need to put a budget in front of our school boards, and at that point in time, the only thing we're sure of is we're probably looking at a mandatory increase in our PSERs, along with other kind of annual increases.
That's a pension payments, right?
That's correct, sir. The Pennsylvania retirement system. So, and we do not know what the state's going to budget for us. So we have to look at a worst case scenario every January when we budget for our schools. And what it ends up being many times is cuts in staffing and in programs, just because we don't have the finances available to continue to offer what it is. My district, fortunately, is more fiscally sound than most. And in my own district, to be able to balance the budget on a yearly basis, I've cut over 31 positions in my school over the last 5 years, 20 of them being in teaching positions.
And how's enrollment been?
Stable. I would say my enrollment for Lower Dauphin has been fairly stable.
Okay, so it's stable, and you still have had to make cuts. Jay, let's go to another aspect of this. We hear, and I don't want to get into this whole issue, the political side of it. I don't want to talk about that, whether or not the governor cut the budgets or not. But the fact of the matter is that, in my memory, school districts have not faced the kind of fiscal challenge that you all are describing now. Without assigning blame, what, in your judgment, representing business officials in the state, needs to be done? Well, if you got the magic wand, wave it. What do you want?
Well, we're trying to deal with a 1980s or perhaps 1990s funding system at best. We're clearly decades behind in recognizing student populations, in recognizing what's happening with the local tax base, in recognizing the accountability process for schools across the state. So I think the number one thing is we need to look at how schools are funded from the state level. We clearly have an over-reliance on the local property tax, right, and property taxpayers certainly understand that and realize that. What we've been missing is a good, sound, fundamental policy in what the state commitment will be to schools, and I think that's the number one issue.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to ask Sherri Smith about property taxes in her district, what constituents say. I'm sure she hears a good bit about that at school board meetings. We'll take that up, and the big State Funding Commission is looking at how funds are actually distributed to the schools. Hugely important. We'll take that up after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Business Council and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation.
All right, Sherri Smith, talk about this heavy reliance on the property tax and how important that is to get. I presume everybody, you want some relief the same and more state funds, which have been shifted dramatically away from the school districts, the loss of funds over the past a couple of decades. What's the situation?
It's incredibly inequitable from district to district. But for instance, at Lower Dauphin, 60% of our funding comes from our local tax base, which is obviously a heavy reliance. And we have to rely on that based on the state funding. The difference is that many of my neighboring districts have a heavier reliance on that and don't really collect the amount of local taxes. They just don't have the wherewithal to be able to do that. So it causes this inequity in programs from students that may be in your neighboring districts compared to yours. Yeah. And that's why a state formula on basic education would help to make that more consistent for all students.
All right, now let's talk about the Funding Commission. It's now underway. Folks are traveling around the state trying to get a feel for it. There's been a dramatic shift over decades. Less dollars from the states, more dollars locally raised, and basically, the way the appropriation works now is from the state legislatures, you get whatever you got last year, you get a percentage more, but no differentials based on all sorts of problems. Talk about that. What needs to be done to get school funding straightened out?
Well, I think we need some predictable basis and some cause and effect so that A, schools can have some sense of long-term planning. Number two, they have some sense of what happens into the future as opposed to a guessing game. And in fact, not only into the future, but year by year. As you heard Sherri say, you sort of start the budget process and you're just probing around trying to understand what may happen, and you may not know till your budget's already been adopted. So if we can look at some predictability, some cause and effect, and everybody knows.
But there's no relationship between poverty, between the number of sort of kids with certain kinds of problems. Let's separate special education from that. That's funded differently. So you got all these differentials in school districts. Some are wealthier, some are poorer, and there's no relationship between the money that the state gives. Tell me if I'm off base here.
Well, we've institutionalized this hold harmless, meaning you get what you got last year, regardless of what your student population changes are, regardless of what kinds of special students you may have, English language learners, students in poverty.
So that's my point. The formula, right now, there isn't any formula, and shouldn't whatever gets done take all those factors into, I mean, that's just fair, it seems to me. It just makes sense.
Absolutely. That would create the equity, I think, across the state from district to district for our students.
How optimistic are you?
Well,
that we'll get a funding formula that, deals with some of these problems?
I think I'm relatively optimistic in part of the equation, and that's the formula. We've had formulas in Pennsylvania.
That's true.
We've had three. We've had ESB that everybody seemed to like for a fairly significant period of time. We've had the costing out study formulation. We've had formulas, so we can do it. I think if you took a group of these 15 members on this statewide commission, put them in the room and say nobody comes out till we get a formula, I don't think it would take that long, because I think, Terry, some of the issues you talked about, students in poverty, English language learners, square mileage in district in terms of transportation costs. I think everybody could come to a reasonable conclusion. I think the critical issue that I'm not so optimistic about is the state willing to not only make the formula, but make the commitment?
All right, look, I want to thank both of you for providing, I think, what's a really important update. All right, well, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.